Welcome to this module on market sizing. In this module, we will be covering how to go about estimating the market size in a structured and client friendly manner. We will also be applying the market sizing approach to our Stream Pro case example in order to make the learning more tangible. Now, let me start with the typical approach that we recommend that consulting aspirants take or implement when they are doing a market sizing exercise. First off, you need to um, decide whether you will approach the estimation from the demand side or the supply side. For example, let's say you're asked to estimate physical book sales in the US. Now, here, the demand from readers is the key constraint, right, or the key bottleneck. So, therefore, a demand side estimation is more appropriate. However, if the question is to estimate sales of a specific bookstore, right, here the operating hours and number of staff become the key bottleneck or the key constraint. So therefore, a supply side approach is more suitable, right? Because the supply side drivers here, which is operating hours and number of staff, is impacting the number of books that will be sold, right? Or book sales in this particular bookstore. After we have decided whether we will approach this question through a demand side or a supply side mechanism, we then move on to setting up the equation, right? After we have set up the equation, we should align it with the interviewer. After the alignment with the interviewer, then always I recommend ask the interviewer if you have some information to share in terms of um, um, what value we should assume for each of the variables in the equation. If the interviewer suggests us to take assumptions, right, we then take logical assumptions for each variable, right? So first ask and then assume, right? So if the interviewer tells you that, let's say he says, Ashwin, go ahead and take logical assumptions, then you go ahead and make logical assumptions for each variable in the equation, right? After you have all the assumptions in the equation, only then you move on to performing the arithmetic or, performing the math. Walk the interviewer through the math, right? And provide transparency in terms of the interviewer, the intermediate and the final results. Always emphasize accuracy over speed here, right? You don't get brownie points for doing the math fast. But if your math is not accurate, that's a problem, right? Also, what I would recommend is that either walk the interviewer through the entire math, right? Voice over the intermediate answers, or at appropriate junctures, provide him the intermediate answers. And because often what happens is that candidates, let's say, take a minute or two, they go silent and then come up with this final answer. But at that point of time, the interviewer has no way, or he doesn't have a way to correct you, right, or understand where you went wrong, right? So it's always important to provide intermediate results to the interviewer so that he can guide you if you go wrong somewhere in the middle. After you've got a quantitative answer, then we perform a sanity check, right? By comparing the answer to an intuitively comparable number. For instance, if let's go back to the physical book sales example that we took initially. Let's say you come up with an answer that there are 3 billion physical books sold annually in the US, right? Now you can do a sanity check by dividing the US population um, from 3 billion, right? And you would get to an answer that each US resident would be buying 10 physical books per year, right? So 3 billion by 300 million gives you an approximation that each US resident is buying 10 physical books per year. Now, this number seems quite high, right? It's unlikely that each US resident on average is buying 10 physical books, given the preference for digital books, preference for Kindle, etc. Therefore, now what we do is we revisit our equation, we revisit our assumptions, and make necessary adjustments to arrive at a more accurate estimate. Finally, we synthesize, right? Um, we try to relate the answer back to the case objective, right? and try to synthesize what does this answer mean in the context of the case objective as well as the client's situation, right? Now, having gone through the approach, let's try to apply this approach through our Stream Pro example. Let's revisit our structure logic for Stream Pro case, and let's assume the client wants us to prioritize the market expansion idea that we have listed, right? And let's assume he wants us to focus on estimating the revenue opportunity if Stream Pro were to enter the Latin market, right? First of all, I think we should clarify uh, any specific understanding that we're not clear about. For example, it's possible that you're not clear what LATAM means, right? So it's good to clarify, right? So let's assume you clarify with the interviewer that LATAM means um, all Central American and South American countries. So you have essentially a list of potential countries that LATAM region constitutes, right? And you could also clarify here, does the interviewer wants us to estimate the revenue opportunity in dollar value, or does he want us to estimate in terms of number of subscribers, right? So after you've clarified, you know, these areas with the interviewer, then you move on to the applying the market sizing approach. First, we try to assess whether we will employ a demand side approach or a supply side approach, right? Here, I think a demand side approach makes more sense because the limiting factor is the number of consumers interested in streaming service, right? So therefore, it's more appropriate to take a demand side estimation approach. After deciding whether to apply a demand side or supply side, then we move on to setting up the equation, right? You should always walk the interviewer through your equation. For example, you could say something like, um, "This is my equation. Let me walk you through it. First, I will consider the LATAM population. Then I will multiply this by average number of members per household to get to number of households in LATAM because I'm assuming that when we say user subscription, it's primarily each household taking a subscription, right? Then I would multiply this with percentage with internet access to understand what or how many households have internet access, right? Because most of the Latin economies are developing, so therefore I cannot assume everybody will have internet access. Then I would consider what percentage of households are interested in streaming, right? Because I assume some might still be preferring satellite TV to streaming. Then I would consider what target penetration that Stream Pro can achieve within the next 3 years, right? So essentially, we are trying to understand what market share Stream Pro will have. Let's say they enter the market in the first year, and at the end of the 3 years, what market share they can capture. And then I would consider the average revenue per user in the Latin market, multiply that by 12 months to get to the annual revenue um, that LATAM as a region will provide to Stream Pro, right? Then I would move on to looking at assumptions. First, I would ask the interviewer, would you have any information to share related to each of these variables that I've listed? If not, I can make some reasonable assumptions, right? Let's assume the interviewer tells us, go ahead and make some assumptions, Ashwin, right? So this is how I would make assumptions, right? So first, when I consider the Latin population, I do not know the Latin population, but I know the population of the US is 300 million. And um, and based on my understanding, a lot of these countries, right? One, there are numerous countries, and second, some of them are quite large, right? For example, I know that I think Brazil might have a population more than 100 million, right? So therefore, perhaps a intuitive assumption to make here is the Latin population is twice that of US, which is 600 million, right? Then I would consider 4 members per household. So it's multiplied by 1/4. I would consider 70% of Latin population has internet access, 60% are interested in streaming. Then I would consider that, let's say, Stream Pro enters the market in the first year. And in a 3-year period, let's assume they're able to garner 15% of the market, right? Because they are large streaming company, they might have attractive, unique content, and therefore 15% of the market could be captured. I will assume an average revenue per user. Now, I don't know LATAM average revenue per user, but I know in the US, streaming would cost somewhere between $12 to $14. Again, assuming LATAM GDP per capita is maybe half of that of the US or maybe even lesser. Therefore, I will assume perhaps $6 here. Multiply that by 12 months should give me the annual revenue opportunity, right? Then we do the math, right? You would do the math. For example, in order to calculate this, we would do 600 into 1 by 4, it's around 150 million. 150 million into 70%, and that gives me around 105 million. So 15 to 7 is 105, so that's 105 million. 105 million into 60%, right? 60% of 100 million is 60 million. And 60% of 5 million is 3 million. So it's a 63 million households, right? Or 63 million potential overall subscribers who might be interested in streaming services. Then multiply that by the market share estimate that StreamPro might get. So 63 million into 15%, that gives me approximately 6.3 plus 3.15, right? So that gives me around 9.5 million. Multiply that by $6, right? So I can round this up to 10 million. So that gives me $60, right? Or $60 million essentially, right? And then finally multiply that by 12. So that gives me 12, 6 or 7. That's around $720 million and approximately $0.7 billion, right? Once I've done the calculations, then I move on to sanity check, right? So here, the 0.7 billion revenue opportunity, I can compare it to the 600 million Latin population, right? Which results in an average spend of around $1.2 or $1, right? It seems reasonable, right? So a consumer, or on average, each member or each LATAM resident spending around $1 on streaming sounds reasonable. Finally, we synthesize, right? What does this mean to our client objective, right? So our objective is to get $1 billion revenue increase, and 0.7 billion equates to 70% of that increase, right? Which means we still need to look at other opportunities to get the remaining $0.3 billion, right? Now, let's recap what we have learned so far. So what we have learned is when it comes to market sizing, you would typically be asked to estimate the size of a market. The questions could range from, let's say, how many cars are sold in the US in a year, or let's say, how many bookstores are there in the US, right? And then in market sizing, you first need to decide whether you will take a demand side estimation approach or a supply side estimation approach. Then you lay out your equation, right? Then, when it comes to making assumptions, before you make assumptions, ask the interviewer if he has any information to share. If not, you make logical assumptions for each variable in your equation. Then do the calculations. Do it one step at a time. Share the intermediate results with the interviewer so that the interviewer is able to correct you if you make any mistake. Then do a sanity check. Compare your final quantitative answer with an intuitively comparable number. And finally, synthesize. Provide the so what of the analysis that you've just conducted. Thank you for listening. In the next module, we will be covering another type of analysis that is typically asked in case interviews, which is data interpretation. Thank you.